Today we're talking with Dr. Kellie McElhaney, who is an adjunct professor in the Institute for Business and Social Innovation at the Haas School of Business at the University of California, Berkeley. She also teaches at the UC Berkeley Center for Executive Education. Her research and teaching are in three areas: the economic and business value of investing in women, global macro trends and business solutions, strategic corporate sustainability. Along with two other faculty members, she is developing a new gender equality initiative at Haas. In 2013, Professor McElhaney was awarded the Earl F. Chait Outstanding Teaching Award, and in 2013, she received the Founder and Visionary Award from Haas. Kellie keynotes for and consults to global 1,000 companies and organizations all over the world in developing integrated investing in women and corporate sustainability strategy. She earned her BA from the University of North Carolina, her MA from Ohio University, and her PhD from the University of Michigan. Welcome, Kellie.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today. I wanted to jump right into a topic that I know you've done a lot of research on, and that is the intersection of corporate social responsibility and diversity. Does the presence of women at the top positively affect the environmental and social impact of the firm? Can you give us some examples of that?
I became very interested in whether or not there was a correlation between having women in leadership and the firm's corporate social responsibility performance, both because my traditional background is in the area of corporate social responsibility and corporate sustainability, and because now I'm looking more and more at what are the effects if you get more women into leadership. I want to be really clear on that. It's not saying no men in leadership, but just escalating the numbers of women in leadership. I did some research that looked at what the database called ESG performance of the firm, which is environment, social, and governance performance. This is a Morgan Stanley rating of Fortune 500 companies and how they perform environmentally, socially, and in their governance structure and outcomes. And we went and looked at the number of women on boards. Our N was either 0 women on the board or 1 or more. We didn't have a lot of robust data because as of yet, only 16.1% of Fortune 500 companies have even one woman on the board. And what we found was that there was a correlation between companies who had 1 or more women on the board and improved environmental performance of the company. So higher investment in renewable energy, reduction of packaging, reduction of water usage, things that really improved both the financial performance of the firm, because if you reduce waste, clearly you reduce wasting of money as well, and things that really contributed positively to the environment. So the highest correlation that we found was with environmental performance of the firm. The second highest was with improved social performance of the firm. Things like food and beverage companies transitioning from less healthy products, more sugar-laden products, to more nutritional products. Someone like Indra Nooyi really trying to shift Coca-Cola's beverage portfolio into more sort of healthy waters, the snack portfolio into lower fat foods. Things like higher investment in talent management, offering more transparent financial products. So that was the second most significantly correlated. And then finally, governance was significantly correlated above the level of statistical significance. And the way that I talk about that is less misreport of numbers, less fraud, less corruption, and potentially fewer CEOs being carted off in handcuffs when you have some women on the board.
So are you saying beyond a strict data correlation, it's actually causal? I mean, the impact is really causal?
It's a really good question. You can't prove causality, particularly because our N is very small. We just don't have enough women at the board level or even in executive C-suites to prove causality. I have heard a very interesting view on causality, though, that if you have 25 correlative studies, most reasonable people would start to assume causality.
What about when you're talking about women leaders? There was a great article recently about the Oakland Raiders. Talk to us about that.
So I am self-proclaimedly a huge NFL fan, and my father was an ex-NFL player, so it's something that is very near and dear to my heart. Incredibly disappointed with not only the incidents of domestic violence that occurred in the NFL over the past, probably has been occurring for quite some time, but we've been hearing about it in the past 2 years, and the complete and utter lack of leadership that I watched the NFL fail to bring forward. I have a former student who went into the Oakland Raiders in a strategy position. In fact, the president of the Oakland Raiders is a Haas alum and now this director of strategy. He took my Investing in Women course. And we got to talking. He actually called me and said, Professor, I need to meet with you because we can't sit by when the NFL isn't stepping up and leading as the Oakland Raiders and do nothing. So can we get together and talk about the options? So I got to know the Oakland Raiders leadership team, and at first was just incredibly inspired that they cared about this issue so much. We did a little research into why this should matter to a team like the Raiders, to the NFL, to any NFL team out there. And in fact, women represent a faster growing fan base of the NFL. They represent a significantly higher representation of purchasing of tickets, purchasing of NFL apparel. Mm-hmm. So if you just take this on a straight business case, if you don't even want to talk about the morality of abusing their wife, their girlfriend, their child, you could take it from a pure business perspective that it does not make any sense for the NFL, for the Raiders, to alienate part of their fan base.
So what is the Raiders team and their leadership doing that's beyond lip service?
We looked internally at the leadership of the Raiders, and they have a significantly higher number of women in their own leadership ranks. You can see that they care about it from the data intrinsically. We also looked at Fred Biletnikoff, which is one of the greatest former Raiders out there, who very tragically lost a 20-year-old daughter to domestic violence. And so he and his wife have done a lot of work in building safe homes for survivors of domestic violence. Mm-hmm. And it was just really a strategic, very easy fit for the Raiders to partner with the Biletnikoff Foundation and give cash, give visibility during Raiders games of domestic violence and the issues therein. And it's just been a very amazing experience of a team stepping up. They've developed partnerships with the Girls Club, doing a lot of work in really trying to develop girls who have a more powerful voice, a higher sense of physical presence, are involved in sports. And it's just been wonderful to see our hometown taking a significant amount of leadership positioning in this space.
Right. And ironic, too, given the history of the brand of the Oakland Raiders. When you think about
being a bit rough and tumble.
Right. Has it had, or is it too soon to tell, if it's had any kind of ripple effect, like are other teams picking up this cause as well?
Well, yes. Other teams are picking up this cause, in my opinion, in a very reactive and far less substantive fashion. There's an example of a team, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, for example, and their reaction to the domestic violence situation and trying to give some sort of lip service to this was to develop a Football 101 program for women. The assumption was that women need to be much more knowledgeable about football while we're sitting there and watching the game. So it was the fundamentals of the game. Part of the Football 101 program brought in NFL recipes, great things to cook while you're watching an NFL game, and even NFL style and fashion tips.
Right.
You can see a difference in how substantively the Tampa Bay Bucs reacted to this situation and how the Raiders reacted in very different ways.
You talk about intrinsic and how it can happen. Maybe it happens organically, I don't know, but does it need to start at the top? So do you have to have the figurehead in these kinds of sports or these kinds of companies be the female leader, or can it be that they've hired in a lot, in the middle management level?
The leader has the most power. So if it isn't somehow embraced at the top, I would expect that lots of times it grows organically from the bottom or the middle of the company. But if the leader doesn't put this top of his or her agenda, you're going to run into ceilings, to brick walls. Here's another great example, transitioning from the Raiders, who are doing phenomenal work and really are the first mover in the NFL space. Mm-hmm. Salesforce, Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, has really stood up not only to talk about why this is critical for Salesforce. They're doing a 10-year retrospective, looking at data on gender pay gap, on promotion rates that may or may not be different for women over men. He's now paid out a couple of $1 million to bring women up to par with men in their same position. Sometimes there was men who were lower. So he's going back and actually spending money on this. He's been very transparent about his data. So as Salesforce, he's stepping up in a leadership role and talking about why this matters to him, why this matters to Salesforce, what kind of a company he wants to be running. Another thing that I very much admire that Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, is doing is he's stepping up and saying, hey, other CEOs, where are you on this issue? Where's your leadership? does this matter to you? Because as a sector, tech is taking a hugely significant negative reputational hit for lack of diversity across the board and their corporate numbers.
We're here near the Silicon Valley area where you teach at Berkeley, and there's executive leadership for women. I'm wondering what advice you could give for the women that are, in the trenches in the tech fields right now.
Speaking up is one of the first effective steps. I am not convinced that leaders in the tech sector are inherently bad individuals. There's a social psychological phenomenon called homophily from which we all act, which is to surround ourselves by people just like ourselves. If you have a significantly higher proportion of men in tech, you're going to naturally hire in people that look just like us. Mm-hmm. So I think the first step for women is to speak up, to really test the waters in terms of, is there a lack of awareness? The other recommendation I would have for women in tech is to work with men, really go in there and engage men in the conversation. This cannot be a women's only conversation. I feel like in a way we are at risk of pink ghettoizing this whole issue of gender equity. And start with a business case. All of my research and consulting and teaching in this space is looking at why companies perform better when you have a higher level of gender equity inside of the company. There's a great study that shows that teams who are performing tasks who have a greater number of women and men in the room show more collective intelligence, higher collective intelligence. In other words, they perform the task much more effectively. There are a lot of studies from Credit Suisse, Morgan Stanley, McKinsey that show that companies who have a higher amount of gender equity in the C-suite perform better financially. The share price is higher. The share price performs better, particularly in a volatile market. The company takes on less debt. And if they do take on debt, which is sometimes an incredibly valid financial strategy, they pay the debt back higher. There's better talent management if you can't be what you can't see. So if there are no women at the top, you tend to leave because you don't see yourself in that leadership structure. So when I work with women and men who care deeply about this issue, I really recommend that they start with a solid business case. It is not a smart strategy to divide your audience and say, you don't care. That is often not the case.
So are you suggesting then that when leadership courses are taught focused on women in leadership, that we invite in and have men at the seat too?
When I work individually with companies, I now will not work with a women's leadership program that doesn't include men at any stretch. I do not think that men need to be in there the entire time. I think that there is a very effective strategy and impact when you have women in more of a safe space, because there are differences. It's not better or worse, but there are differences in how women lead. I'll give you a couple of examples. We tend to apply for jobs when we perceive that we meet significantly high, if not 100%, of the job characteristics listed in the job description, which is virtually impossible. We all write job descriptions for somebody who probably doesn't exist. Whereas a man will look at a job description, and if he feels that he meets 60% of the characteristics listed, he'll throw his name into the hat. So if we aren't even putting our name into the hat for these jobs and moving into leadership positions, we aren't going to be successful. So there are lots of data out there that really do pertain to how women may be holding ourselves back. It's a difficult situation because there is some speculation that says women are holding ourselves back in terms of not fitting into what is a more male-based model. I believe that you need to work on changing the model, but you also need to work on women not holding ourselves back. We don't tend to choose to negotiate as often as does a man. We are fantastically good at negotiating for our team. We are not as good at negotiating for ourselves. We don't ask for as much money. And when I hear about gender salary gap, I am sure that some of it is systemic implicit bias, but I also think if we're not asking for as much, we're not going to get as much.
What lessons are there perhaps that we can learn from women in high-profile leadership positions at, say, Facebook versus Yahoo?
I am a huge fan of Sheryl Sandberg and have done a little bit of work with her because she did start this conversation. She really brought this conversation to the fore and made it into what is really now a culturally relevant conversation, she admitted that there are ways in which she had held herself back. She talked about women who worked for her, who, wouldn't sit at the main table in a meeting, who chose to sit at a perimeter seat in a meeting. One of my favorite stories, there's so many great stories in the book, she's a very effective storyteller, is a time when she was working at Google and she was very pregnant and was pushing the time on a meeting that she was supposed to attend. Parking was full. She got in a bit late, so she had to park in the very back of the parking lot. She came rushing into the meeting and was incredibly winded, which happens when you try to move fast as a very pregnant woman. And the CEO at the time said, "What's going on? Are you okay?" I'm sure he was very concerned that she was going to go into labor in the office. And she told him she had to park in the back. And he looked at her and said, "So why don't we put maternity parking in the front? We can reserve some spaces." Very easy ask, no problem to do. And I think just making women aware that they have a voice. The situation at Yahoo is a bit different. Marissa hasn't spoken out as much on how there may or may not be gender differences in her leadership style and what she's trying to do. But there is an interesting research finding. Women tend to get chosen for difficult leadership roles, a company that may not already be doing well, to a much higher level than companies would choose men. So the board of Yahoo chose Marissa at a time in which Yahoo was struggling in a very large way. And there might be something to look into around that, because there's a much higher failure rate. And then the world can tend to attribute that failure to the fact that she's a woman.
That the fact that maybe they were set up not to succeed as easily.
On the other hand, Marissa Mayer she appears to be a highly risk-tolerant leader. She's clearly successful in her past. And I could imagine with somebody who has that kind of a driven personality, it's a big challenge to go into a company that's really struggling and try to right-size it.
Can you give us more examples, perhaps, of what other companies are doing to invest more in women?
I'm happy to say that there are some great examples starting to pop up out there. One of my favorites, and a company on whom I've written a case. And by the way, they also perform very well in the sustainability space. Usually it's very surprising to people that I would talk positively about this company, but Walmart has done a fantastic job of not reacting and doing little things here and little things here in ways that are completely disconnected, but sitting down. CEO, first thing he did, the previous CEO, Mike Duke, was to recognize that there were issues, that this was something he cared about, and he put together a CEO council of women leaders, almost like his internal consulting team of women. The women developed, along with Mike, the CEO, strategy, and it was a 4-pronged strategy. 3 of those prongs were looking at internal women and men in their leadership structure. What was the gender equity? What was the parity? They actually do quite well. They are a Fortune 5, they're a Fortune 1 company who has 3 women on their board, so they're already outperforming at the top tier. They have several female presidents, president of Walmart Canada, president of Sam's, both are women. So they found that they are doing quite well. And that's a straight business play. Over 80% of shoppers of Walmart are women, so it makes a lot of sense. They looked at training programs for women, and were they developing the right sort of support structure, leadership training to really make women feel that they could put their name in the hat if they didn't meet 100% of the characteristics. The 4th prong was really taking a look at their supply chain. And they have invested significantly in female-owned enterprises who produce products that are then marketed inside of Walmart. And about a year ago, they launched a label that is on products sold in the store. So now you're consumer-facing, that says women-owned enterprise, so that this product came from a female-owned enterprise. They've doubled their sourcing in women-owned enterprises. They've implemented a hands-on training program for females in the supply chain who may not have access traditionally in the developing world to traditional business training, to an MBA, and they're utilizing Walmart employees. They're partnering with nonprofits on the ground. It's a really effective strategic partnership model to provide training to these female entrepreneurs to really help make them much more successful.
Well, you started out by saying you'd be surprised to know, and we know, like in the general mass media, there's been a history of, lawsuits or negative press for Walmart. So is this a shift in leadership you're saying it's not reactive? So can you explain a little?
There is a lot of speculation that it is reactive. They have won, but been hit with one of the country's largest gender equity case. It was not found to be true. I tend to be someone who doesn't get as caught up on motivations. Maybe that was one of their motivations. I tend to look more at the impact. It doesn't matter why they were motivated, but if they're having a significantly positive impact, that's what matters to me.
Maybe there's some more examples of companies making that social environmental impact, and is it due to women?
What I tried to do with the study that I mentioned, looking at environmental, social, and governance performance and women on the board, since we couldn't prove causality, was to go out and interview female board members. And it was really fascinating to hear some of their responses. One woman who worked for an investment bank said, I don't want to interview because I don't think there's any correlation. Women don't behave any more differently than do men, which may be indicative of what does happen in the investment banking space, because I would say historically women have had to look like men to be successful in that space. It's a heavily male-dominated industry. But some of the other female board members, one woman said, I get asked to serve on multiple boards. I have to choose. I can't serve on them all. I self-select into companies who are either already performing well on a sustainability metric or who are at least grappling with this and talking about it. The third woman sat there and said, I don't think there is a difference. And she thought about it. And then she realized that on one board on which she sat, she did self-select into the committee of the board that was focused on corporate shared value. This company is very engaged on corporate shared value, and she self-selected into the committee of the board, and she had never really thought about it, but she said, this is something I'm passionate about.
Shifting just slightly and talking more generally about CSR and sustainability, and I hear you interchanging those words. Can you help define them for us?
I tend to use the words corporate social responsibility or CSR interchangeably with sustainability. There's a segment of the population and business leadership that will just confine the word sustainability to environmental performance. I tend to use them interchangeably to what they are doing in the environment, what they are doing in society, how they're really making a positive impact in the world. But because I'm very focused on business return on investment, on ROI, particularly I'm a former banker, so it was really hammered into me to focus on ROI, which I think is a fantastic strategy. I really look at CSR strategy as it is first and foremost a high-impact business strategy. So something that everybody's talking about right now is this millennial generation, people in the workforce under the age of 30, maybe 32, and how different this generation is, how difficult they are to engage, and they are showing to be one of the lowest engaged employees. They don't tend to stay at companies as long as previous generations. But one thing that is very clear about this generation is that they care about contributing positively in the world. So you can actually see in some companies, if you compare employees who are highly engaged in the company's sustainability strategy, their engagement level with the company goes up, their level of satisfaction with the company goes up, and companies are struggling with recruitment, attraction, retainment of this millennial generation. So there's a significant correlation there. In penetrating consumer bases, get back to the women topic just for a minute, women do tend to choose to purchase more sustainably. So they will purchase a product that is focused on some positive environmental or social impact as opposed to a product that has none of that. Those are business strategies and reasons to engage in corporate social responsibility. If you reduced packaging, if you reduce waste, if you reduce energy usage, there is a solid business case first. It's great for the environment. It is also great for the company's bottom line. And to me, that's effective corporate social responsibility strategy. It's really playing at the intersection of what a company does well. So if you're a highly data-based company, if you run significant databases, which of course suck a lot of power, produce a lot of heat. I was just working with a company the other day that captures that heat from the database center and uses it they put it back on the grid. So that's an incredible, powerful win-win for the company and for the environment. And it stays true to the company's core competencies. They understand how to run database centers, how to capture wasted electricity and heat from that database, as opposed to this tech company looking at let's run a Toys for Tots program over the Christmas season. It's not really a deeply embedded strategy. It's a one-off.
Yes, I'm interested because there has been a lot written about millennials and authenticity and what they seek in the brands and the products that they buy, and how that relates to what you're talking about. Does it cut across all different industries, or are there certain industries where it defines who they are?
I think consumer products is the highest area in which millennials have shown to care with their purchase decisions, primarily because a consumer product is very much a social badge. So if I'm wearing a pair of Tom's shoes and Tom's has the 1-for-1 program, I'm socially badged in society amongst my peer group as caring about changing the world or contributing positively to the world in a way that's highly visible. And that just shows that I really, this matches my core values. This matches authentically who I am. So when Tom's first launched, you could not walk across a college campus or a high school without seeing a really high proportion of millennials walking around in Tom's.
So maybe compare or contrast to Nike. Is there any research on that?
There's no, Nike's, they're two totally different sized companies. So somebody like Tom's, which is private and owned by one CEO, Blake McCoskey, who is himself a millennial, it's easy to develop a strategy and to push that strategy through. I'm not going to say that Nike doesn't care. They were one of the first companies to work with the Fair Labor Association. In fact, they helped launch the Fair Labor Association. You talked before about motivations, Students Against Sweatshops, which was a significantly powerful force that developed on college campuses, really took Nike to task on the factory conditions from which they were sourcing their footwear, their clothing. Nike reacted with a deep, comprehensive strategy to go through and not only enhance the standards of their own factories, but when you have a factory that from which multiple apparel and footwear companies source, you're raising the floor for all of those companies. You're getting all of the companies to say, we have to care about this. Nike has done some interesting work around recycling of tennis shoes, and they grind the rubber from those tennis shoes and utilize it to develop playground surface areas for schools that might not be able to afford to have playgrounds, or at least to have updated playgrounds. They do a significant amount of work. It's become kind of a have to have. I feel like they were one of the first movers out of the chutes, but now other companies are starting to surpass Nike.
How does that intersect, or what would be the advice in terms of brand presence? How do you take what you're doing and tell people about it, tell your audiences about it, but not come off as,
self-serving?
Yeah, self-serving.
I get asked a lot about the risks of a company communicating its corporate social responsibility, its sustainability strategy. First of all, if you're not communicating it to consumers, to your millennial employees, to your female employees who care deeply about this, to new markets into which you're trying to enter, you won't get the credit. You won't get the reputational enhancement. You won't get the brand differentiation. Companies have to talk about it. What is happening in our society, or probably what has historically always happened, is we have this odd tendency as human beings to, when a company steps up and says we're doing something, to find 16 ways in which they're not doing something. My response is, look, sustainability is never going to be an end game. We're going to always have to improve our strategy, evaluate our strategy, sort of shift or pivot on our strategy. And we're in a world today where companies are getting criticized anyway. Global companies are one of the least trusted entities to operate in society's best interests in the average person's mind. So they're already getting criticized. They have a choice. They can get criticized around things that they are trying to do well, or they can be criticized for not doing anything. So if they're not communicating any of their sustainability strategy, the general assumption is they're not doing anything.
Any other advice that you would give to whether you're a startup or a big company in terms of sustainability and social impact?
I call it age-appropriate sustainability. If you're a startup, you don't have a lot of resources lying around. You don't have a huge amount of employees. You don't have a lot of power as a small company right out of the chutes if you're not truly a social impact-oriented company. There are a lot of startups who are, focused from the start on social impact. Revolution Foods being one of them, founded by two women, probably a correlation there. But if you're a big company, I think it's absolutely incumbent on you to see the power that you have in the world and how you can harness that power for good. So water is top of mind issue for everybody right now, particularly in California, given our drought. If Coca-Cola does not work on solving our water scarcity issue, they're going to run out of a product. Mm-hmm. Coca-Cola is coming from water. They have invested heavily in developing water purification systems, water filtration systems, so that they can go out there and improve the standards of water, not only water from which they're drawing, but water that is serving a community in an underdeveloped world. It makes sense. It's a fit for them. There's a business reason and there is an environmental and social reason, and that's the perfect mix.
Talk to us a little bit about how CSR has evolved.
It used to be one single person who was responsible for the green team inside of the company or for EH&S, environment, health, and safety. So the rest of the employees would probably naturally say, this is not my job. This does not affect me. There's somebody over in the environmental office who's managing this, so why should I do it? It's really evolved in the sense that, A, it's been put on to leaders' agendas. They've talked about how the company has the ability or is contributing positively to the environment. But more than that, they've set sustainability goals, which are very visible, measurable. And a company like Intel now looks at every employee and said, your job is to do your traditional job, which is to produce product or, manage our operations. But your job is also to contribute to our success at meeting our environmental goals. It's just now, it's expected. It's not effective use of resources to siphon this off into the foundation. You're not going to get very far.
Does it not only then expand, I'm thinking of Starbucks, does it not only expand markets, but also in a positive environmental way?
It absolutely expands markets. I mean, you have folks who jumped over to Starbucks because they were one of the first coffee companies to look at fair trade, to look at paying their coffee growers a fair wage. And it makes sense. If a coffee grower in, let's say, Costa Rica is not being paid a fair wage, that coffee grower is not going to be as productive as a coffee producer, as a bean producer. They're not going to provide as high a quality of bean than a producer who's struggling to make it in society, who can't afford housing, who can't afford health care, who misses days on the job, whose crop suffers because of simply lack of ability to spend all of his or her time on that crop. Even speaking of the agricultural sector, we have a population situation in the world that it's projected that we're going to be feeding 9 billion people by the year 2050 with the same Earth's resources. If you give a woman in the developing world equal access to seed, training around farming and production and land, which is a big issue for women in the developing world, a female farmed crop outproduces a male farmed crop. That's something that we need if we're going to be feeding the amount of people that we are projected to need to feed by 2050.
Does that then become one of the brand pillars? Not just, again, something that they do just because they have to do it, but because it is part of what their brand represents for certain companies.
I do think brand is so front and center for consumer-facing companies. We've had a shift in recent years where brand used to be significantly connected to what we call tangibles, the share price, the financial performance of the company. Today it has moved significantly into intangibles, reputation, treatment of employees, treatment of workers in the supply chain. And when you have that shift, corporate social responsibility doesn't predict all of brand success, but it is starting to predict a larger percentage of brand positive reputation or negative reputation. So brands love it. If you have an example of Whirlpool, who has a really deep strategic partnership with Habitat for Humanity, and if I'm going to Sears to shop for a refrigerator, that's not a very differentiated product. They're all heavy metal cold objects. But if I see a Whirlpool refrigerator in that lineup and they have a sign on it that talks about their partnership with Habitat for Humanity, it's a natural shift to say, I want to support this brand. It's still going to be cold. It's still going to be a functional refrigerator. It still has a freezer, but I get this added feel-good effect of supporting what the company is supporting. This is what CSR does to a brand, is it connects with the consumer more on an emotional level. And We can talk about how critical data is for predicting human behavior, but emotional connection predicts brand, predicts connection every single time over more traditional data-based strategies.
There's been a lot written and or hypothesized about is capitalism based on a masculine model? Could you speak to that?
Well, effectively, capitalism has been developed by men because they have historically been in charge of not only developing the capitalistic structure, but running it. I do think it is based on a masculine model of, winning at all costs, hiding things that may tarnish your reputation or things that you shouldn't be doing, like dumping waste into rivers. I do think that's changing. We are getting more women into positions of leadership, but I also think there's something that we aren't talking about enough, in such that men are socialized and expected to win at all costs. And I think when a man steps up and says, I do want to win, but I'm not going to sacrifice the environment to win, there can be social stigma with that. When a man steps up and says, I want to lead in this situation with compassion, that's not really what men have traditionally been pushed to do. I'm really excited with this millennial population because they tend to have a little bit more comfort level, both men and women, with what you might say is their feminine energy. Women tend to score higher on collaborative decision-making, on compassion. And I think that with this younger generation, you're seeing men who say, I absolutely want to lead with compassion. I absolutely want to work more collaboratively. And that's going to be a good thing to mix a masculine model with a feminine model and make both characteristics acceptable in the way how companies are led, expected in how companies are being led.
Great. And on that compassionate note, we're going to say thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for allowing me to talk about my passion areas.